Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about brands today. And I want to talk about brands in a couple of different ways. As you can imagine, for us, Animoca Brands, we have brands in our name. And the reason that we have brands in our name is because it is a core theme for how we develop games. We're both a game developer and a publisher. In terms of the games we develop, though, the majority of them leverage third-party intellectual property. So we license well-known brands that you might know, characters like Doraemon and Garfield and Ultraman, and we make original games featuring those characters. We also have a publishing business where we work with third-party developers, everyone from indie studios to big global game developers, and publish their games as well. But the focus of the business is on leveraging brands. Okay, we're based in Hong Kong, so we're very much an Asian gaming company in terms of our geography. But in fact, we distribute our products worldwide, and I think it's a little bit reflective of the nature of Hong Kong, where we are as a sort of a trading center, because we actually do roughly half our business in so-called Western markets and the other half in Asian markets, which I think makes us relatively unique in that capacity. Now, moving on to talk about brands generally. There are two parts of a brand. One is to build a brand. So you start from scratch and you build your own brand. So something like in our industry, Rovio with Angry Birds started with just a game concept and eventually built a very large brand out of that game concept. And by the same token, the other side of branding is leveraging a brand that already exists, like Doraemon in this case, and employing that brand in other ways in which it can be used. So rather than in anime, using it in gaming, for example. So I'm going to talk about these two different paths and ways that we can use brands or create brands in mobile games. Now, clearly it's important to leverage brands, whether you're building them or using them. So I've taken an example here which is near and dear to all our hearts, which is the App Store, in this case, the iTunes App Store. And what I wanted to do was take a look at, this is a snapshot of the top grossing chart a few weeks ago, and I wanted to take a look at the impact of brands on the App Store, because this is one of the primary reasons that we all think about branding in terms of mobile games is merchandising, product placement, user acquisition. So if we remove the non-game apps in the top grossing chart, first I'll congratulate everybody because clearly our industry is doing a good job since this is the top grossing chart. And then we start to look at which games are leveraging brands created by third parties. So if you look, we have feature film IP, we have IP from cartoons and comics, all sorts of IP, Sims and Marvel and Hobbits, etc. When we layer on top of that, which apps have become brands in and of themselves due to their successful implementation as games and then expansion beyond games to game franchises and merchandising and such, you get a lot more participants, okay? So it's clear that focusing on the building of and maintaining of a brand is key to participation in sort of the upper echelons of the revenue part of our business, just by this sort of simple example here. Now, going back to Rovio and Angry Birds, I go back to this example because it's the most mature example, and frankly, I'm cherry-picking because it's a brilliant example, okay? With Rovio, they started with an initial game which was just a game and built a brand out of it. So obviously, you would expect there would be the spin-offs, different versions of Angry Birds in the Jungle, Angry Birds in Space, etc., so that they built a franchise based on those original characters that people began to love. And those characters helped them to bring users from one game to the next and give credibility to new game launches because people were familiar with those characters. They'd built a brand around those Angry Birds. But the next step in their evolution was then to think about what can we do now more with those brands? Beyond just sequels and expansions of the original games, how can we then start to work potentially with other third-party brands? So they started to do sort of brand mashups and partnerships with other companies. So you've got your Star Wars Angry Birds, your Transformers, your Rio, so a lot of film tie-ins in this case. And I want to point to this because I think that this represents kind of the best implementation of licensing for our industry. Because if you look at a scenario like this, you end up with a case where it's a real win-win situation for both the game publisher, Rovio in this case, and also for the brand licensor, the movie studios who license that IP. Because what you're doing is essentially you're cross-pollinating between two universes of fans. And you're allowing those fans to experience new products that may be interesting to them via the gateway of the brands that they already know and love. So in this case, you know, Angry Birds had an existing audience, right? And Star Wars had an existing audience. And we can all argue over which audience is actually bigger and how much of it overlaps. But the reality is there is a portion that does not overlap on either side. So putting Star Wars into the Angry Birds setting brings a lot of Star Wars fans into mobile gaming or into Angry Birds that may not have been there before, right? And vice versa. Angry Birds fans who are younger and may not have been familiar with the films may have gone and sought out the films. So that cross-pollination is very important. Same thing goes for the other feature film IP. And then the last point, of course, is for the film studios and the brand licensors, they were interested, I'm sure, in accessing Rovio's mobile audience and finding a way to extend their brands into mobile gaming. So that was an important win for them as well. So I think that, you know, in this case, if we look at this example, everybody benefits both on the licensee and the licensor side. So that sounds great, okay? Everybody would love to build an Angry Birds franchise and build a big brand, you know, and that, you know, same goes for Candy Crush from King or, you know, Supercell and Clash of Clans. All these big titles have the opportunity to build great brands on the back of already successful titles. But the problem is this requires either two things: a lot of luck, so you are a Flappy Bird, right, to coin a term that's been used a lot, or you have to spend a lot of money and be very creative. You need to do a lot of user acquisition, you need to do a lot of marketing, you need to do a lot of advertising, because building a brand is not easy. Just think about, you know, the best of breed in the branding industry, which is fast-moving consumer goods. Think of Procter & Gamble and Unilever and Coca-Cola, et cetera. These are companies that take very, very basic sort of utilitarian products, you know, sugar, water, right? And they spend a lot on marketing, they sponsor sports teams, they do all kinds of things to build brand mystique so that you prefer their sugared water over somebody else's sugared water, okay? There's a science to it. The problem is this requires a lot of money, okay? So building a brand is not easy. So what I would like to do, and that's not obviously to discourage you to do it, but I think that the exercise of brand building is something you should think about when you start the game design and game building process. But until your game has a certain amount of success, it's not something you need to preoccupy yourself with because it comes later, okay? But in thinking about branding in mobile games, I want to talk about the other side of the coin. The other side of the coin is licensing brands. And this is where we come in because we license a lot of brands for use in mobile games. And licensing brands, we feel, is a very effective strategy in our industry because similar to the Angry Birds example I gave earlier, it allows brands and game developers to partner to bring their audiences and worlds together and create great products. So here's a good example, Garfield. Garfield is a character who we license. He is, as people may or may not know, the world's laziest cat. And he's famous as an animated cartoon in the United States. But Garfield actually has a reasonably wide reach. He's popular outside of the US. He's reasonably popular in, you know, Western countries, in Western Europe, in Latin America, and surprisingly in some Asian countries as well, because he's seen in translation. And he's been around long enough that he's become somewhat of an iconic cartoon character. So even if you don't know that Garfield is very lazy and always hungry, you might recognize Garfield. So there is brand recognition through Garfield. So what's the process of creating an app with Garfield? First, we have to work with the licensor to understand what is the essence of that brand and how do we translate that essence into a game. So we have to figure out from everything from the art style in the cartoon strip to what are the key attributes of the character? Fat, lazy, has very few friends, etc. Has a very sharp tongue and a strong attitude. And those are sort of key brand identities. And we want to be able to bring that then into a game. But the trick for game design is, what kind of game are you going to produce? In this case, we created a tower defense game, which was very successful. And I think tower defense is not necessarily, you think maybe like strategy or fighting or sort of Arthurian legend and things like that. You don't necessarily associate the tower defense genre with a fat, lazy cat. But in this case, what we did was we translated the story into something that made sense in the milieu of Garfield, which was, fighting the food invaders. So he's defending the refrigerator against the food invaders because he doesn't want them to take his food. Now, it's humorous, so Garfield is a humorous subject. It involves all the characters that Garfield fans know and love, and it stays true to the brand. And that's the most important thing, because our job as licensees of branded IP is to stay true to the original IP, okay? And then we take that and we agree with the brand licensor, where are we going to distribute it? Is it going to be a global product? Is it going to be a regional product? Where does Garfield have an existing audience that's large, that we can leverage, an existing fan base? And that's the basic calculus of how we work together with a brand licensor. So let me move on and talk a little bit about the mechanics of licensing. Licensing is a relatively straightforward business. It's been around for a long time, particularly in consumer products, so things like plush toys, etc., Happy Meals, you name it. And for our industry, licensing works in a very similar way. So typically, there could be some minimum guarantee paid up front to the licensor against future royalties. Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. And then there's a royalty payment. So the licensor is going to expect that there is some royalty based on the revenues that your products that you create with their brand produce, and then you decide what that appropriate royalty payment will be. Now, in our industry, that royalty payment is generally net of platform fees, so it's similar to a publishing deal where it'll be a percentage of revenues after platform fees, and sometimes it's after marketing costs as well. These are up to negotiation between you and the licensor. I put these up here because these are just sort of general guidelines, but there's a lot of wide range of flexibility in the middle. And the last thing, of course, is royalty rates. And again, I put up a big spectrum. I mean, if you had to put a finger in the air, you could say 30% royalty is kind of the median, I would say, in the industry. But I put up 25 to 50% because it really depends on the type of IP, the perceived value of the IP, the existing audience of the IP, and those kind of things. And also to your negotiating leverage, right? So, but that is, I think, typically the general range. So when you think about creating this as a business structure, I think it makes a lot of sense in our industry, because what you're doing is you're creating a partnership with the brand. Because by paying a royalty, you're actually paying a percentage of the back-end revenues. You're sharing your success with the licensor, as opposed to investing a lot of money up front, like in the original example of building a brand, where you spend all the money up front in user acquisition and trying to get people to recognize your newly created character. In this case, you and the brand licensor are co-investing in the project, and that's the way that we like to look at it. So, I have to talk about user acquisition. One of the key drivers, I think, for a lot of game developers to think about using brands and branded IP in their apps is user acquisition. Because user acquisition costs, as we all know, have been going up and up and up, and they don't show any signs of slowing down. And user acquisition has become more difficult and more challenging as there is more competition in the App Store. And I apologize, I put up iTunes, but Android, everybody, including all app stores, competition is extremely fierce. So using a brand and branded IP in your app, I believe, and we believe as a company, does make visibility easier. The reason is because brands have existing audiences. Garfield, my original example, Garfield has fans who are fans of Garfield. There are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people around the world who go to the App Store or go to a Google search box and search for Garfield because they're fans of Garfield. And that is organic traffic, and that leads to discovery. And so that's one of the key drivers for, I think, a lot of mobile game developers to take a look at the possibility of using brands in games. Now, obviously, visibility in the App Store gets a lot better once you have branded IP. And then the last corollary is, there is always a possibility of featuring by the App Store because, branded IP does command a lot of presence. You'll notice that, when EA comes out or Disney comes out with their big branded titles, featuring often follows because those are the kinds of brands that appeal to consumers. They make the App Store look good. They generate a lot of downloads and a lot of traffic for the App Stores. So there is a win-win situation for the App Store to focus marketing attention on those branded apps as well. So let me talk about one example here, which is not from us, but from Glue, which I think is a perfect example of the effect of licensing IP into a game. So I'm sure many of you may have seen Glue speaking here yesterday, where they didn't announce their cooperation with Katy Perry, but that was interesting news overnight. Here is an app on the left called Stardom Hollywood from Glue, and then obviously Kim Kardashian from Glue as well on the right. Now, this is a very interesting case study because as Glue has publicly disclosed, the Kim Kardashian app is largely based on the game Stardom Hollywood, where they had a very successful original game, which was a female-oriented RPG, and they then made a deal with Kim Kardashian to integrate her brand and her likeness in the game and create a version of the game featuring Kim Kardashian. Okay? This had a very big impact. So we can see, there we go. If you look at the statistics, okay, so number of times featured on the iTunes homepage, featured in iTunes, number of countries ranked in the top grossing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There is a clear distinction between these two games. The biggest one to me is estimated monthly revenue, the last line. I think that speaks for itself. But what is the difference between the two games? Gameplay? No. Anything? It's just the brand. In this case, this is a very extreme example. Obviously, this was really the first major celebrity-led branded app in the app stores available. And so this particular magnitude of success, I think, will be very hard to replicate in the future because the first one out always does disproportionately better. However, I think as Glue talked about yesterday, the fact that Kim Kardashian has a huge social media following played into this, right? Again, it goes back to user acquisition. If you have 28 million Twitter followers, user acquisition becomes a lot easier. And again, this app, Kim Kardashian, was, for lack of a better term, a joint venture or a co-development between the two because Kim was putting in her brand and her 28 million Twitter followers and her however many millions of Facebook followers and the 3 minutes that she has on the Ellen DeGeneres talk show and all of these outlets that she has for promoting the app, and she injected that into this deal. And Glue injected a very well-polished game. And together the two cooperated to create this successful deal. Okay? And as a result, as has also been publicized, there is a revenue share, a royalty on the back end for Kim Kardashian. And it's been debated at 40%, I think, is a number that I saw, which would be a sensible number, in my opinion, if that were the case. Because, frankly, it was a big win for everybody. And it allowed, I think, this example, when you see how popular this app was, it proved that the brand of Kim Kardashian was able to bring a lot of users into a mobile game style who either were not familiar with that style or maybe were not into gaming at all. But they were into Kim Kardashian, and so they became game fans. And that's a key use of the brand. So if we look back at the last chart that I talked about, I would add one more thing here, which is promotional effect of a celebrity spokesperson. So if you do choose a celebrity as your brand which you're licensing, then that is a huge value add. Okay? I'm conscious of time, so let me wrap up briefly with just a couple more slides. One other sort of recast on the branding idea is let's not forget that games are brands as well, as I mentioned. So in this case, this is a game that we acted as the publisher for. You may or may not be familiar with the Ragnarok Online series of games from Korea, from Gung Ho, and from Neocyan, actually, subsidiary of Gung Ho. But in this case, we brought this series of titles to mobile, and they were famous for being web game titles. So we took an existing web gaming brand and brought it to mobile, again, leveraging that web gaming audience and that brand from web gaming and bringing it to a new audience and a new platform on mobile. So that's another way of thinking about leveraging brands. So the last thing I want to leave you with, because I don't want to paint too rosy a picture, licensing is not easy, okay? Working with brands is not easy. It's a very particular type of skill. What you need to remember when you think about it, I mean, licensing a brand and putting it in your game makes great sense to the people who are doing user acquisition, the people who are doing monetization, the management. But for game developers and game designers, one thing that can be a challenge is having other bosses in the room. And the other bosses who are physically or not in the room are the brand owners. You have to stay true to the brand. The brand will always have the right to approve artwork. They will have the right to make commentary on your gameplay style, because at the end of the day, it's their brand, and they will retain those rights. And their mission is to make sure that you're not, sullying their brand. That's the most important thing. They care a lot less about the incremental revenue you will generate for them than if you make a mistake and make their brand look bad and jeopardize their toy sales and their merchandising and all their other core business. So they are very conservative organizations. They choose their partners very, very carefully. And as their partner, you have to work hand in hand with them at every step of the way to approve the creative process. And that is a management task in and of itself that is quite different from just traditionally, making a game and the studio head makes all the decisions and you blast out the game and make it as great as you can. So I think working with brands is fantastic, but I would obviously urge some caution because it's definitely not as easy as it might look. But if you do work at it, there are tremendous rewards. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Robby. Great talk. Very informative. We have some time for questions. It's coming up.
What's your methodology, tactics, and strategy for closing these deals? How do you actually find the brands? How are you acquiring these, closing these things? Garfield's a good one, by the way.
Okay. There are many ways. There are a lot of licensing conferences. So the licensing industry is a well-developed and mature industry, and there are licensing conferences specifically for brand licensing, where people who manage brands or agencies who manage brands attend these conferences, and people who are interested in licensing brands also attend to meet up. Now, those conferences, the vast majority of them tend to be for physical goods, so people who want to put a brand on a lunchbox or some kind of product. But we do game deals there as well. A lot of brands actually approach us because they see our existing work with other brands or are introduced by other brand partners because it's a relatively small industry amongst licensed brands. You'll notice we work with a lot of Japanese companies in the anime industry because it's a relatively small circle. So I think once you have a little bit of traction and credibility, it does become easier to get to know other brand licensors. And then also we do a lot of cold calling because there are a lot of great brands out there, and there are always ways to get introductions and meet people. So it's just a matter of dialing for dollars and trying to find your way into doors.
More questions? So you spoke a bit about how the licensor protects the brand and how they have the last approvals and so on. How much does it slows down the development? You know, how much of an obstacle can it be?
It completely depends on your relationship with the brand licensor and also their level of busyness. I mean, to a certain extent, it's not any different from any partnership or, you know, such as publishing. It depends on what's highest on people's agenda. I think one of the things that can impact the process if it's not very well organized, if you don't have very strong project management, then there's not a clearly delineated time schedule of who needs to provide approvals for what and when, and what's the bureaucracy on the part of the brand licensor. I found that with brand licensors, the two easiest types to work with are either the ones where licensing is their primary bread and butter and it's a well-oiled machine because it's a big corporation that just licenses and licenses and licenses, or where you're talking directly to the actual person who created that branded IP. And so it's just one person who makes a decision for everything. And those two situations tend to be the most smooth.
Okay. Another thing that interested me is when you were talking about Kim Kardashian deal, you said it's 40%. Actually, I think I saw somewhere 45, but anyway, it's like 40 to 45%.
Yeah, I actually don't know the exact percentage, but that's what I read.
Which is still higher than the average of 30, which you were saying initially. So I'm curious, do you think that that deal and the publicity it received actually made an impact on the expectations of celebrities or big IPs in terms of how much they should be getting?
Not necessarily. I think the only thing that will be unfortunate is that the success of that deal will have both positive and negative effects for companies like ours. On the positive side, I think it opened up the eyes to a lot of celebrities and people who may not have thought about licensing their image to mobile games, and now they take it very seriously because they see there's real money there. But on the other hand, it may have mismanaged their expectations of the revenue potential and upside, because I suspect that, you know, in the wake of this very successful cooperation, there are going to be a lot of, you know, less successful cooperations. And so people might find that, you know, licensing their image to mobile games is also not as easy as it looks.
And in terms of minimum guarantees?
Yes.
Obviously, it depends from a brand to a brand, but is there like a certain range which tends to prevail?
The minimum guarantees, and also just to clarify, the minimum guarantee is not a sort of blanket cash payment. The minimum guarantee is usually an advance against future royalties, and it's something that the brand licensor does on the one hand to ensure that there's a level of commitment from the licensee because there's cash up front, and also to make sure that if, you know, the project is a complete failure, there's something recouped. But at the end of the day, that does get recouped on the back end against royalties. The minimum guarantee range varies widely. I mean, I've seen people asking for multi-million-dollar minimum guarantees and people paying them. And then there are plenty of brand licensors who don't request a minimum guarantee. So it does vary widely. I think one of the things that impacts it is you'll find that for licensees who have no track record at working with brands, they will typically be requested to provide a minimum guarantee. Mm-hmm.
And maybe as a tip to anybody looking to get into licensing, what is the licensor looking in a game developer?
I think they're looking for steady hands. They're looking, as I said, for people who will make sure that the game and whatever the product produced is stays true to the brand, and that there's a level of professionalism and integrity in the creation of the product that makes their brand look better and adds value ultimately to their brand, regardless of necessarily what the bottom line revenue potential is.
Yeah. So we heard one example earlier this conference where a rock personality basically went from one game to the other because he felt the opportunity was bigger. How do you stop people from using the approval process as a way of just backing out of a deal totally?
Okay. That's challenging. I mean, I think, there's always, partnerships are always tricky things to manage, and you can try to employ contractual means to, as carrots and sticks, or the stick part of the carrot and stick, to keep people aligned. But I think what always makes the most sense in our experience is ensuring that there's a reason for everybody to stay at the table and stay focused on getting the deal and the product done. And I think that, we try really to maintain close personal relationships with the people at the brand teams, so that they have a good vision of what our schedules are and our pipeline and our products, because the better informed they are and the more confident they are that we're meeting our plans and schedules and timelines, then the less likely they are to be looking around for other opportunities. Sorry, I can't hear you.
See a better opportunity and what if they just see a better opportunity and they just do this just to basically get into the better opportunity? How do you contractually, I've seen things like, approvals shall not be unreasonably withheld and all that, but, in the end, if, particularly with personalities, they decide they don't want to continue with the deal, there's little you can do.
Yes. And frankly, that example is exactly why I said brand licensing is not as easy as it might seem. Fortunately, with people like Doraemon and Garfield, they don't complain as much as rock stars. But I think, yes, that is a definite hazard to working with celebrities, particularly when they are, live individuals, for sure.
Last question.
Yeah, just a very short question. The top 3 kids IP that you can think of, just how successful are the kids licensing kids IP for games like this?
I think kids IP is very successful. Frankly, some of the IP that we license, like Garfield, is sometimes perceived as kids IP, but is in fact, I would argue, quite universal, because I grew up on Garfields and I'm not a kid anymore. So I think that some of those IPs tend to be evergreen and appeal to a wide-ranging audience. I think when you think of kids IP, the one thing that we have to consider very carefully these days are regulatory concerns, because the marketing of apps to children is a constantly shifting regulatory environment, particularly with COPPA in the United States. So there are both technical challenges as well as well-founded concerns on the part of licensors, because the licensors, as I've been saying, don't want to jeopardize other businesses. So, if they're concerned that, let's say, regulation in mobile games with children, regards to children, is not clear, then they would rather stay out of that business until there is clarity in order to protect their brand.
Thank you so much. Great talk.
Thank you, everybody.